Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie Poser. I am the Outreach Librarian for the NOAA Central Library, and I will be your host today. So we are very pleased to have Julia Byrd, Meg Withers, and Chip Collier from the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, or the SAFMC, with us for today's presentation. Laura Ormland would love to be giving this presentation and this introduction instead of myself, but she's got a little bit of a cold going on at the moment. So Julia, our speaker, is from the Council's Citizen Science Program. She's the Council's Citizen Science Program Manager. She oversees the Council's citizen science efforts and helping connect fishermen, scientists, and other stakeholders to develop and support projects that address SAFMC research priorities. Meg Withers is the Council's Citizen Science Project Coordinator. She supports the project SAFMC. I will get that faster, I promise, later on. The project's release, which collects information about released shallow water grouper and red snapper. She works with participants, performs outreach, and monitors the project's data. Chip Collier is the Council's Deputy Director for Science and Statistics. He helps to oversee the Citizen Science Program, the CDAR program, and analyses for management needs. He also conducts much of the analyses for the program and organizes review of the products. Julie will be giving the main presentation, as I said, and Meg and Chip will help address the questions and comments in our Q&A. So now that I've finished stumbling over myself, I will let Julia take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Katie. And I think we're going to turn off our cameras for the presentation and then turn them back on when we get through the Q&A. So we're really excited to be able to chat with you guys today about how the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council is using citizen science to support kind of the fisheries in our region. And before getting into things, although there are a few of us here doing the presentation today, I think it can't go without saying our program wouldn't be possible without so many amazing partners and volunteers throughout our fisheries community. So we've had stakeholders who helped develop the program, design projects, help with data validation, volunteer for our projects, have had really wonderful data management and outreach partners, as well as a lot of support from our council members themselves and our staff. And also wanted to give a quick thank you to the folks who've helped support the program monetarily. The council has supported a program manager position, and we've been really lucky to have been able to get some grants from NOAA Fisheries, the Atlantic Coastal Cooperative Statistics Program, or ACCSP, and Pew Charitable Trust, who have funded some of our kind of project work. So the first kind of question is, I guess, why citizen science and why the South Atlantic Council became interested in it? And kind of before getting into that, I also just wanted to kind of acknowledge that there are kind of many names for citizen science, participatory science, collaborative science. And so when we're using the term citizen science in our program and in the presentation today, we're meaning for it to be really inclusive, meaning any members of the public who are working with scientists to collect scientific information. And so the South Atlantic Council is involved in kind of the marine fisheries world, but I think a lot of the reasons we became interested in citizen science kind of bridge between many different natural resource managers. And so we have kind of limited resources, and we're having to deal with increasingly complex management issues, things like climate change, or needing to better kind of quantify and understand the past to better understand what's going on today. And so we really want to be able to increase the capacity and the amount of data we have so the best management decisions can be made. Kind of along with that, there's been this huge growing interest in citizen science. There was a publication back in 2015 from McKinley et al. That looked at the number of scientific publications that use or study citizen science. And so this figure on the slide is from that publication, and you can see in 2010 kind of the exponential growth. Congress also passed the Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science Act back in 2016, and over the past couple of years, NOAA has named citizen science kind of a science and technology focus area, as well as has released their citizen science strategy. And so the presentation today is we just really wanted to share the story of how the South Atlantic Council became interested and pursued citizen science. And so to do that first, in case some of you aren't familiar with who the South Atlantic Council is, we'll kind of introduce you to who we are and what we do, talk a little bit about how we developed the program, highlight how we select projects and develop projects, and then talk about a couple of our projects that are underway now. And then we want to kind of end the presentation with kind of the lessons we've learned thus far. Our program is pretty new, so I feel like we're learning lessons all the time, but wanted to hit on a few that have been really important to us as we've been growing the program. So the South Atlantic Council itself, we're one of the 8 U.S. regional fishery management councils across the U.S. These councils are tasked with sustainably managing federal fisheries. And so there's kind of a regional approach which allows you to tailor regulations to your region. So things that may work in Alaska may not work great in the South Atlantic US. And so the way these councils are set up, it allows you to kind of tailor your regulations to what will work in your kind of location and with your fisheries. And so the South Atlantic Council itself is located in the southeastern US. We're headquartered in Charleston, South Carolina, and we're responsible for managing fisheries in federal waters, so from 3 to 200 nautical miles offshore from the North Carolina-Virginia border down south through the Florida Keys. And so we manage a large range of species, over 61 species that are very diverse, everything from bottom fish like snapper and grouper, to more migratory fish like dolphin and wahoo, to things like shrimp and coral and sargassum. So a really wide range of species that we manage over really diverse habitats over a fairly large latitudinal range. And we have limited resources to support science and data collection. So there's one NOAA Fisheries Science Center that supports a lot of the data that are collected for 3 of the regional fishery management councils here in the Southeast US and US Caribbean. And so even though there's some kind of limitations in the data that we have to make decisions, we still follow federal fisheries management law and have to prevent overfishing. And so that's what really led the council to become interested in citizen science. So we have some long-standing data needs. We had consistently been hearing from fishermen in our region that they wanted to be more involved in helping collect the data used to manage their fisheries. And so citizen science could provide that opportunity. And I also think another thing that's worth noting is right now the South Atlantic Council is the only one of the 8 regional fishery management councils that has a specific citizen science program. And so to kind of kick off the launch of a program, we first decided that we needed to hold a workshop back in 2016. And we brought together kind of fishermen and scientists and managers from across the region. And we were really lucky to also have a couple of citizen science experts, Rick Bonney and Jennifer Shirk, come together and really brainstorm for a few days on, if we had a citizen science program in our region, what would we want it to look like, or what would we want it to do? And so what came out of that is what we called our program blueprint. And so that was basically a framework to build a program based on all the input we got from our workshop participants. And so kind of our overall program's approach is we really want to try to support projects that are filling data gaps and addressing council-specific research needs. We want to make sure we're supporting projects that complement or supplement existing data programs and partnerships, not compete or replace them. We want all of our projects to have kind of intentional design. So we're thinking about the direct application of the data to be used kind of in a management context. We're really strongly encouraging fishermen and scientists collaboration. And we really wanted the program to kind of serve as an umbrella to support kind of internal projects where we're doing the day-to-day kind of running the day-to-day operations, and then also external projects where partners are running kind of the day-to-day operations, but their projects are supporting some of our management needs. And so one unusual thing that the council did when they started kind of the citizen science program is they decided to invest upfront with building a program as opposed to an individual project. And based on some of the feedback we got from the citizen science advisors we had, that seemed like a really unique or unusual approach. And one of the reasons the council felt it was worth doing that is because in many ways from the workshop that we initially held, success was tied to having results that were useful to management or assessment. And we work in this kind of regulatory framework. And so the council felt that building a program would give individual projects their best chance of success. So to build the program, we put together kind of 5 stakeholder-driven teams made up of kind of fishermen and scientists and managers and outreach specialists and data management specialists. And they came together over the course of about 15 months and developed kind of best practices, recommendations, and project support resources over these 5 areas kind of on the slide that we felt were critical to the success of the program. And what they developed really became the heart of our program and became our kind of standard operating policies and procedures. And our stakeholders also really played a big role in helping us do some kind of big picture thinking and strategic planning, helping us develop kind of our mission and our vision. So the vision is kind of where we want to go. So advancing science and increasing trust one project at a time. And the mission is how we're going to get there. So we want to build and maintain this program that improves information for fisheries management through collaborative science. And so our stakeholders also helped us kind of identify 4 our overarching goals that we wanted the program to do. The first one's really focused on kind of building and maintaining a program. So our stakeholders have done a ton of work to build the program, and now we're working to maintain and strengthen it. The second goal is focused a lot on the development of individual projects, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, highlighting a couple projects we have underway now. The third goal is really focused on data. So something that we really heard from kind of our initial planning workshop is that we wanted to make sure the data get used. And so we want to make sure kind of data are fit for purpose and accessible. And then the last goal is focused more on kind of the relationship aspect of things. So we want to make sure we're fostering kind of mutual learning, collaboration, and engagement amongst all of our different stakeholder groups. Another thing we were really interested in making sure we tackled when we developed this program is we wanted to have not just regular kind of project evaluation, but overall kind of program evaluation to make sure the program was doing what the council wanted it to do. And so we have kind of agreed upon goals and measurable objectives and have talked about what success looks like. And we're trying to kind of develop this adaptive project process for developing projects to help them kind of produce data that meet kind of the council's needs. And then one of the kind of other things that we're really excited to be doing, we're working with a couple of researchers to help us collect baseline information to address that 4th goal that's focused more on kind of collaboration and engagement. And the researchers we're working with are trying to kind of help us better understand the motivations and attitudes of kind of our three of our main stakeholder groups, scientists, managers, and fishermen. And so getting their kind of motivations and attitudes for citizen science and citizen science use in kind of a fisheries management decision-making process. And so we'll be getting results from their efforts over the next year or so. And then we've also developed specific citizen science kind of research priorities. These are updated every 2 years with input from our citizen science advisory panels. And they really help kind of prioritize the council's many data management needs into kind of tangible ideas for projects that we can work to support and develop. And so a couple examples of these research priorities is one is collecting more information on released fish or discards, in particular, kind of the length of released fish. And another one is kind of learning and collecting more information on historic fisheries through photos. And so we'll be highlighting a couple of the projects we've developed to try to address those needs in a few minutes. But before getting into those specific projects, wanted to talk a little bit about how we kind of come up with project ideas or select projects to pursue and how we develop them. And so some of this is really kind of opportunistic and depends on the resources or funding that are available or kind of who we're partnering with and that sort of thing. But kind of internally, we have kind of a checklist we go through when a new project idea comes up. And so we want to make sure that a project kind of meets an identified citizen science research priority by the council. We want to make sure that a project is helping address a specific data gap or a data deficiency. We want to make sure that we've clearly identified how the data could be used in a management or assessment context. And we want to make sure those discussions have had input from kind of potential data end users. We also want to make sure that the project would work well with the citizen science approach. And so when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about things like, how clear is the research question? How simple is the protocol? Is this a topic that participants would be motivated to collect information about? All of those different things. And then we're also looking to see what resources are available, not necessarily just funding, but kind of what other capacity we have, kind of people-wise or partner-wise, that we could bring to kind of help develop and support a project. And so once we've kind of identified a project and it kind of checks all those boxes, the next step that we like to do is form a project design team. And so this has been kind of a really unbelievably helpful part of the process we've used in project development. And so I wanted to kind of highlight it a little bit more. So we call them project design teams, but what it really is just kind of a group of stakeholders or a panel of stakeholders that have diverse expertise that we bring together to provide guidance during a project being developed and its implementation. So kind of they meet fairly regularly as a project's being developed and help provide input on a variety of different topics. And so some of the reasons this has been so helpful to us is because it's let us kind of incorporate some of our science partners or data end users from the start of a project, so they can provide input on, how best to design a project so the data meet their intended use. It also can help with buy-in by getting them involved early. It also allows an opportunity for you to have some of your potential volunteers involved in the design of a project, and we, say that volunteers can really keep the project based in reality. Just because you may want 15 data fields to be collected, that may not be reasonable, or volunteers may not be motivated to do that. And so there's really kind of this communication back and forth between these two groups that we found critical in developing projects. This also allows you to have kind of discussions on what success would look like and kind of what the expectations are for the project, what it can do, what it can't do. And so it's important to communicate those sorts of things clearly with project participants, but also we found to the wider kind of council community when we're talking about our projects. So right now we have kind of 3 projects that are underway. 2 are more kind of internal projects where we're running the project management, day-to-day management, and those are SAFMC Release and Fishery. And then we have kind of a 3rd project, which is more of an external project that's really being run by the REEF program. So that's a really kind of successful citizen science nonprofit group that works with recreational divers. And that project is really focused on working with divers to collect linked information on some of our data limited species using kind of a handheld stereo camera. And that project just kind of kicked off not very long ago. But what we want to do for kind of the next few minutes is talk about the 2 projects that we're kind of running internally to the council. And so really want to talk a little bit about kind of why we selected these projects, how they're helping us fill data gaps, kind of who the volunteers are and what data are being collected and how it might be used. And so first off is our SAFMC Release project, and Meg is the one who's doing a lot of the work here. She's coordinating this project. And this was the first project we developed as part of our program. So what we were trying to do was really kind of bring fishermen and scientists together to design a project that would collect kind of supplementary information on released fish using a mobile app that we would help develop. And so the reason we were interested in pursuing this project is because there are the number of released fish in a lot of our fisheries in the South Atlantic is increasing, and so it becomes even more important to understand that portion of the population that's getting caught and thrown back in the water. However, these released fish can't be sampled back at the dock by a lot of our traditional data collection programs. So in the South Atlantic region, we have limited observer coverage, and we also have a really large component of the fishery that's through kind of recreational private anglers or the charter fishery, where there are smaller boats, so that makes it even harder to get kind of fisheries observers on vessels. And so it's really fishermen that hold kind of the on the water knowledge to help kind of collect information on these released fish. And the number of released fish is something that they're concerned with too. And so when we were designing the project, we put together our project design team. So we had kind of fishermen and scientists and data managers, app developers, outreach specialists, all working together to kind of develop the project. And I just wanted to give a few kind of quick examples of why we felt like this collaboration was so beneficial. I think for many citizen science projects, there's kind of a balance between the rigor of the data that are collected and the ease of data collection. And so just because, say, a scientist may want kind of all these different data fields collected, it may not be realistic for a fisherman to want to do that, or to want to do that over a longer period of time. And so through the conversations of this group, I think our project really benefited, because we ended up with a kind of easy to use app that was focused on just collecting information on key data fields that could be collected while you're on the water. And we also were able to have kind of discussions about what success may look like and what that success may look like over time. So back in June of 2019, we launched the SAFMC release project initially. We were pilot testing it on one species. So we were trying to collect information on released scamp grouper. And folks were collecting information in a standalone app that was called Release. And so what we learned was that not many people were releasing scamp. We knew that it was a relatively small fishery, but there weren't many people releasing scamp. They're delicious, so people were only releasing them if they were undersized or out of season. And so from talking to a number of fishermen, they weren't seeing a lot of undersized fish. So not many fish were getting released, so it was challenging to get kind of participants to even kind of remember to log fish, because it was such a rare occurrence. So that led us to expand the program in August of 2021 to collect information on 10 species of grouper. And so these are kind of called the shallow water grouper complex in our region, and include things like gag or black grouper, red grouper, some of the hinds like rock and red hind. And we switched from collecting information in a standalone app to kind of an umbrella app called SciFish that can house multiple citizen science projects. So one of the kind of cool things that was a little unexpected when we developed kind of Release is that there were a lot of different groups who were interested in developing citizen science projects to collect information on released fish. And so instead of having everyone develop kind of separate apps, we instead decided to partner with the Atlantic Coastal Cooperative Statistics Program, or ACCSP, the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries, and Harbor Light Software to develop this umbrella app that could house multiple citizen science projects for kind of partners along the Atlantic coast. And so we moved over to the SciFish app, and we are collecting information on kind of 10 grouper species. And then last year in the spring, around April, we added red snapper to the list of species that we're collecting information on. And so since the start of the program, we've been kind of working with commercial for hire and recreational fishermen, like Justin Carnes, who's in this photo. He's one of our recreational fishermen from down in Florida who's been participating in the program for over a year now. And we're collecting information on 11 different species, kind of shown here on the screen, using this free SciFish app. And so the data we're actually collecting is really focused on better understanding the size of released fish, and better collecting information that will help us better understand how many of those released fish survive. So focusing a lot on kind of fish length, but also collecting information on depth, hook type, hook location, and whether a fish was kind of treated before it was released to increase its chance of survival, or whether anything like shark predation was observed. And so the project started in 2019 on scamp grouper. There was a scamp grouper stock assessment data workshop that occurred soon after then. We provided the information that we had gotten so far for that assessment. It was really limited information that we had collected thus far, and so it wasn't used directly in the assessment. but I think some of the information provided by our participants helped kind of describe the fishery and could help describe trends and in other data sets. And then we're planning to submit information from this project into 2 upcoming stock assessments that are on some important species to us in the South Atlantic, gag grouper and red snapper. And so one of the most challenging things with citizen science projects, at least from our perspective, is in kind of recruiting and retaining volunteers. And so we've had a lot of outreach strategies to do this and have been really lucky to be able to work with a lot of partners to help with this as well. So we've worked with kind of different agencies as well as other campaigns like the Council's Best Fishing Practices campaign to kind of share information about the project and recruit new participants. We've shared things via social media. We've been really lucky to be able to partner with some local charter captains to kind of work on seminars together where they will share information on kind of bottom fishing, and we'll be able to share information on our project release and on some kind of the other council's other initiatives like our Best Fishing Practice campaign. We're visiting tackle shops to kind of build relationships within that community because that's where a lot of anglers go to get trusted information. And on the retention front, there are a couple of things we're trying to do to retain our kind of participants. And one is we send out a newsletter every month that gives kind of information about the program and other things our participants may be interested in. And then also at the end of the year, we put together an annual data summary, kind of sharing information that was submitted through our participants within our kind of fisheries community. And so one thing that we have noticed when folks are joining the project, that doesn't necessarily equate to a release submission. So most of the submissions have come from fishermen we've either had relationships with or we've built some sort of personal connection with. And so we're constantly working on things to do to increase the retention and the number of release submissions. And we were really excited earlier this week, Meg launched our kind of release participant recognition program to really try to celebrate the achievements of all of our participants. And then the last thing I wanted to do was share a little bit of information from our 2022 data summary to give you an idea of kind of who's providing kind of data and participating in our program and kind of what we've learned from the data so far. And so you can see from these graphs, they show kind of where release submissions have come from. So in 2022, we had participants from kind of all of the states. The largest percent of releases logged came from Florida, and the large majority of our releases came from the private recreational sector. If you look at the species that we've been able to collect information on releases, there have been kind of 7 species overall that's been led by red snapper, followed by gag and red grouper. And one of the questions that we were really interested in learning more about was when anglers might be treating their fish before releasing them to try to increase those fish's chance of survival. So a lot of the snapper grouper species are caught in deeper water. And so when you're pulling up a fish from depth quickly, air and pressure will expand in the body, and a lot of times you'll see kind of the fish's eyes popping out or maybe the stomach coming out of the mouth, like the photo in the bottom kind of right-hand corner of the screen. And that's called barotrauma. And when fish suffer barotrauma, they have a hard time getting back down to depth unless they're treated before they're released. And so there are a couple of ways to treat these fish. You can use kind of a weighted tool called a descending device to kind of get the fish back down to depth quickly, or you can vent the fish to release the air before you release the fish. And so one thing we were really interested in seeing kind of when people start seeing barotrauma or using kind of descending devices or venting a fish. And so what we've seen is that as kind of the depth increases, people are more frequently treat their fish either by descending or venting them. So this has been a really interesting thing that we've learned through the data collected through the project thus far. And so some of the key takeaways from this project are, I think that the data we're collecting can help fill some of the data gaps that we're trying to hit through this project. I think one of the things that really stood out for us as we developed the project is this, you're trying to balance this kind of data rigor with ease of data collection, and it just emphasized how important having these project design teams are to kind of project development. And then I think one thing that we've also learned is that kind of volunteer recruitment and retention can be really challenging and can be really resource intensive. And so we're always trying to think of new things to help kind of increase the number of volunteers and keep our volunteers in the program over time. And so that's a little information on one project that's collecting data from the present day. The next project I wanted to share a little bit of information with you guys about is our Fishery project. And this is a project that's collecting information on historic fisheries using old historic fishing photos. And one of the key partners for this project is a retired captain named Rusty Hudson, who provided pictures from his family's fishing fleet for the pilot Fishery project. And this picture on the screen is a very young Rusty with a red snapper. And so kind of why we were interested in this project, I mentioned earlier, but a lot of our finfish harvest is really dominated by the recreational fisheries. And in our region, recreational monitoring programs didn't really get in place until the mid-1970s. Although we kind of knew that there was indication that these fisheries were operating well before then. You can look at stories from Zane Grey or Ernest Hemingway to kind of document some of that. And we also have some of our stock assessments in our region start in the 1950s or some even before then. And so you're having to make assumptions about what the catch was back then. So having more information about kind of the catch composition or the size composition of what was caught during that historic period could be really helpful. And in our region, and I'm guessing lots of other regions, there's kind of a tradition of when you get back on from a for hire trip, kind of hanging up your catch and then taking a photo in front of it to kind of commemorate the trip. And so these historic photos can really provide kind of a wealth of information about what was being caught back in this historic time period. And so for this project, the Fishery project had three main components. The first was just digitizing and archiving historic photos. And through our pilot, over 1,300 photos were digitized and archived, thanks in large part to Captain Rusty Hudson. The second component of our project was trying to gather information on the catch composition from the photos, and we did this using the online crowdsourcing platform Zooniverse. And so I know that folks from Zooniverse did a library seminar earlier this year, and can't speak enough good things about that platform and how it allowed us to kind of analyze these historic photos. And as part of our pilot, we had over 2,100 volunteers make over 35,000 individual fish counts or species IDs through the project. And then we also had a validation team made up of fishermen and scientists who were kind of our fish ID experts that helped review some of the photos where there was substantial volunteer disagreement. And then the third component of the project looked to develop a method to estimate the length of the fish in the photos using the lumber as a leaderboard. And so we pilot tested that method using king mackerel. And so all the photos in our archive were reviewed and king mackerel were measured when present. And so before getting into kind of how the data were collected for the project, I wanted to just give a quick overview of kind of the historical photos in the archive for this pilot project. The photos were all from Daytona Beach, Florida, and primarily were photos from fishing trips that departed from two places, Inlet Harbor and Timmins Fish Camp, and the orange star on the map kind of shows you where that falls along the Atlantic coast in Florida. The photos range between 1949 and 1975, and so the majority of photos were from the 1960s, and there were similar amounts from the 1950s and 1970s, and then there were a few that didn't have years associated with them. We had photos from every month out of the year, with the largest amount from April through August, which likely mimicked the effort in that fleet. And then over 17 vessels were represented in the photos. However, the majority of the photos in our archive right now came from these 5 boats: the Flamingo, the Mako, the Broadbill, the Miss Juanita, and the Marianne. And so before getting into how volunteers collected data, I just wanted to show a couple example photos to show you kind of the range of difficulty in our photo archive. So this is an example of a picture that's a relatively easy photo to analyze. There are only a handful of fish. The fish are spread out. No people are standing and blocking the fish, and there are only 2 species, king mackerel and little tunny. However, if you look at the other end of the spectrum, this is a photo that we very lovingly call a dumpster fire. So even though it is color, the resolution is not great. There are a ton of fish in the photo, lots of different species. If you look closely, you can see that there are a lot of fish on stringers kind of hanging on top of one another. There are a lot of fish in a wheelbarrow, and then there are people standing in front of fish. So this is one of our most kind of challenging photos, and I think it's helpful to kind of see the extremes and the difficulty range kind of within the photo set when you start thinking about kind of how volunteers collected data and start looking at some of the data that were collected. And so to collect data, we did this using Zooniverse. And so through this, we had kind of two tasks that volunteers could do, or Zooniverse called them workflows. And so one was we asked people to count the total number of fish and people in the photos using a marking tool. So the green marks are people counting the fish, and the blue marks would be people counting, volunteers counting the people. To help with data validation, we had 10 volunteers reviewing each photo. We looked at preliminary data, and there's a lot of agreement between the volunteers, so we didn't need any validation team review of this information, and we had all the photos in our archive analyzed through this easier workflow. If you move to the kind of second task, we had a harder workflow where people were actually identifying fish into 16 species or species groups and documenting fish that were obstructed that they couldn't identify. And so to do this, we basically made kind of a tiered data collection versus using two steps. First, we had volunteers mark 4 species groups: red snapper, amberjack, king mackerel, and grouper species, as well as mark obstructed fish. Then before moving to the next photo, they would provide bin counts of their remaining species, which you can see on the screen. Since this was a more challenging workflow, we had 20 volunteers looking at each photo, and we had a validation team reviewing the photo when there was substantial volunteer disagreement, again, to help with data validation. And so through kind of this workflow, we had 1,000 photos completed, and 180 of those were reviewed by our validation team. So one of the things we were really interested in looking into is kind of comparing the photos where both our validation team and our citizen scientists analyzed them to see how much agreement there was between these two groups. So this graph is doing that, and I'll kind of walk you through some of the things that jumped out to us when we were looking at these data. And so on the bottom of the screen, you can see kind of the different species groupings. On the side of the graph, you can see kind of the difference. So the closer the boxes are to 0, the smaller the difference there was between the validation team and our citizen scientists. And if there was a positive difference, whoops, the validation team counted more, and if there was a negative difference, that means the citizen scientists counted more. So when you look overall, there was pretty good agreement between these two groups. And so there were a couple of species groups that showed bias in that the validation team typically counted more than the citizen scientists, and those were kind of the black sea bass category, and then the other snapper category, which was basically any snapper besides red snapper. If you were looking for the largest differences between these two groups, it was with black sea bass and snapper other, and then obstructed fish and red snapper, although you didn't see the bias in kind of the obstructed fish and red snapper that you did in the other two categories. And so obstructed fish, we learned really quickly, it was pretty subjective how people counted that, so we weren't surprised to see the large spread there. And then red snapper was one of the fish seen most frequently in the photos, so that is kind of likely contributing some of the variation seen there. And so since the agreement was pretty good, we can look at this data further to look at things like catch rates and some of the species most frequently caught in the photos, like grouper and red snapper, king mackerel, amberjack. And as we kind of move the project forward, expanding the geographical range of our photos, we are working with folks at kind of the Southeast Fisheries Science Center and NC State University to see if this information could be developed into an index of abundance. And so just quickly highlighting kind of the last component of Fishery and some of the information we're gathering through there. So as we were developing the method to kind of measure fish length, we did a lot of kind of testing of our protocol to see how kind of accurate and precise we could get. We trained our length analysts who were fish identification experts, and then we measured all the king mackerel in the photos. And so just to give you an example of the data that can be produced from this step of the project, we're able to show some of our king mackerel length compositions by decade. And so you can see this is kind of the length composition from the 1950s. The modal length is around 29 inches fourth length. If you look at the 60s, the sizes shift slightly smaller. And then if you look at the 70s, they shift slightly larger. So we can produce kind of up to kind of annual length compositions from the data that we've collected from the photos, although there are differences in sample size by year. And so some of the key takeaways from this project, it shows, I think, that the methods that we developed for historic photos show a lot of promise, and that volunteers can make valuable contributions. Folks that were volunteering for this project kind of volunteered through Zooniverse to analyze photos. Folks volunteered to provide kind of photos for the Fishery project. And then we also had volunteers serving on our validation team. So they played lots of different roles in this project. One thing we also learned is that identifying fish in some of those historic photos, especially those dumpster fire photos, can be really hard. And so I think we figured out some ways where we can simplify data collection to help improve our data quality. And I think a lot of the work that we did during the pilot is going to make the project even more efficient moving forward. And one of the most kind of exciting things that we found through this project is that fishermen were really interested in sharing photos that they had and stories about their kind of time in the kind of these historic fisheries. So we've had a couple of captains kind of reach out after hearing about the project and sharing their photos, and we'll be collecting photos as we move the project forward. So now we're really focusing on trying to expand the geographic and temporal range of the photos, and then also get measurements on species other than king mackerel, with red snapper kind of the next species on the list. And so with that, I just wanted to kind of end with a few lessons that we've learned so far through the program. Again, we have a relatively new program, so I feel like we're learning things every day, but these are some of the key ones that have been important to us as we've gone along and growing the program so far. So one, I think, citizen science can be a really powerful tool for fisheries management. I think that's shown through some of our pilot projects and for many other people who are doing citizen science projects in the marine fisheries world. I also think it gives us, in particular, us being the council, a different way for us to engage with our stakeholders and communicate with our stakeholders. We think it was really important for the council to take the time to develop a citizen science program. When we kind of went down this realm, none of us were citizen science experts, we were fish people. And so I think taking the time to develop the program gave us the tools we would need to develop individual projects. So we had templates for things like communication plans and volunteer engagement plans, and we had kind of research priorities that we could focus in on for project development that really were critical, really, as we were moving the project forward. As many folks who are in the citizen science world know, just because volunteers are collecting data doesn't mean it's a no-cost endeavor. Citizen science can take a lot of time and effort, and I think kind of recruiting and retaining volunteers is one of the things that is most critical and one of the things that takes the most time. We've also found that kind of involving data end users and volunteers early within the design of the process and checking back in with them often over time can be really helpful, particularly if you want the information you're collecting to be used in a certain context. And then kind of the last thing I'll mention is that, obviously building relationships with different stakeholders is key, both fishermen, scientists, and managers, but that can take a lot of time. And again, I think, as a regulatory agency, a lot of times when we're sharing news with our stakeholders, in particular our fishermen, it's often due to a change in regulation, a change in a bag limit or a size limit or a trip limit. So this gives us a different way to kind of engage with our fishermen, and hopefully a different way to help them get their voice kind of involved in the process by allowing them to share what they're seeing on the water through these projects directly with managers. And with that, I'll kind of leave you here with contact information for myself and Chip and Meg, as well as a QR code and a web address. If you're interested in learning more about our project, you can check out our website or click on the QR code and that'll take you directly to our website. And with that, I think we're ready to take any questions that y'all might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. That was awesome. Great to hear. So just as a reminder, I put this in the chat, but I'll say it out loud. If anyone has a question, please put that in the question panel and I'll read that off. But our first question is going to be, through the work done so far, examining attitudes, beliefs of fishers, what have fishers said about their participation? For example, why they participate? Also what motivates them to participate and what keeps them participating.
And so I'm guessing all three of us could probably say a little bit about this, but I'll say something first and then Meg will pass it off to you. I know as you've been developing our recognition program, you've thought a lot about that. But I think one of the things that seems to motivate people to want to participate is to share what they're seeing on the water and to have that data be used. I think one of the things we heard a lot through not only the workshop we did back in 2016 was that I want to collect data, but I want you to be able to use the data and I want to know what happens to the data. I think there were a lot of kind of fishermen in the region that noted that they had participated in a project, but they never knew what happened with that data. So that kind of positive feedback loop seems very important, and knowing that the data are going to be considered for use, I think is really important. And then I'll also say through some of the work that our researchers are doing, Rick Bonney is one of the researchers we're working with, but he did interviews with a number of fishermen, and I think one of the concerns or barriers to participation is that they think the data won't be used, that they don't trust managers or scientists to use the data. And so that's kind of something that a challenge we're kind of contending with in the region too. So I'll leave it there. Meg, do you have anything to add?
I mean, you really hit it pretty well, but I would definitely emphasize that fishermen have a lot of knowledge that they really want to share. And our participants have said that, over and over that, they're on the water a lot and they think that they can contribute a lot of valuable data. And so why not participate in something like SAFMC release? So that's definitely a major drawing point for them and kind of keeps them sticking around because they're on the water a lot. So, why not take advantage of that time to share their knowledge with us and put that to good use?
And then Chip, I didn't know if you have anything to add.
Well, I mean, just dealing with some of the fishermen I've dealt with in the past is they are curious about what they've been catching over time too. And so this also provides them kind of a logbook where they can look back at the size of the fish that they caught and maybe able to figure out what's going on. So they're trying to figure things out just like scientists are trying to figure it out.
Great, thank you. Follow up to that question, how open are fishers to finding scientists how are they finding scientists to using the data from either project?
So I guess I'll start with an example from Fishery, and I guess I'll start with that because when we originally developed the Fishery project, we were thinking that kind of the length data that's produced from it would be most kind of directly able to be used in a kind of management or assessment kind of context. A lot of our assessments, not a lot, but many of our assessments started in the 1950s, so they're having to make assumptions about kind of what was caught back then, and there's really no information about the size of fish. So we thought, hey, this could be kind of informative for that. But then after we kind of shared our pilot project results, we had folks from the Southeast Fishery Science Center reach out to us and say, hey, I think if you got photos from a larger geographic area and kind of a larger temporal range, we might be able to develop that into an index of abundance. And so that's, I think, an example of us not even knowing how all the data could be used, but a scientist becoming interested in our project after we did a pilot, coming up with new uses. So I think there is openness from a number of people, but if I'm being realistic, I think there are also a lot of folks who are have some concern about using citizen science data. I know through some of the interview work Rick Bonney did, folks want to make, it seems like scientists really have a lot of concerns and want to make sure they would use citizen science data as long as it was set up in a way that the data could actually meet their intended use. And Chip and Meg, jump in there if you have kind of other things to say or thoughts about that.
Well, and the other part of fishermen wanting their data to be used is shortly after Julia gave her first presentation introducing the Fishery project, she was delivered 100 or 200 additional pictures from another fisherman. And several people have indicated that they want to be involved. We have one of our council members that wants her photos scanned. So there's a lot of fishermen that are excited about it. And you know, not everybody's around. Unfortunately, where we're trying to get data from is a area that's heavily hit by hurricanes. So the earlier we can get these photographs and the more that we can get now, the better off we are, I think.
Okay, so this next question is a little long, so bear with me as I read through it. And this is coming from a NOAA perspective. We often discuss the need for large data sets or long time series, but also shorter studies can provide useful information, inform mortality, discard estimates, etc. In evaluating potential projects, what types of projects seem to arise or have more potential for citizen science?
So I guess one thing I will say is for at least for our program, we're really trying to hone in on data gaps, places where there aren't any data or where data is isn't sufficient. And so to help us, our program do that, we put together these citizen science research priorities. So how that's done is the council has an overall research and monitoring plan. We look through that, and from research recommendations coming out of our kind of stock assessments, and try to determine which of those may be a good fit for citizen science. If you are developing a project where statistical design is really important, that may not be as good of a fit for a citizen science project, or it would have to be a really well thought out citizen science project. But it's really kind of that helps us narrow our focus down to specific types of projects that we're pursuing. When we're updating our research priorities as well, we get input from our advisory panels. And so that lets us know what fishermen may be motivated to collect. So it's really, you're kind of, and in some ways you're trying to thread the needle of filling a data gap and having that data gap be something that fishermen are also, or whoever your volunteers are, really interested and motivated and helping collecting information on. So I don't know if that answers the question, or Chip, Meg, if y'all have other things to add.
So one thing I do want to, when we were just starting out with the program, what we were thinking about was developing projects that were long-term projects, because that can be, that might require different skill sets than short-term projects. And one of the things that was mentioned in here was estimates of discards, and that's one thing that we're not trying to do. We do have some programs out there that actually estimate discards over a long time series. We're not trying to compete with that, but what we are trying to do is fill some little data gaps that can help inform assessments and management what is needed about those discards. So are they surviving? Are they being treated? And that, I think that's really where the citizen science program fits in well. Another problem with some of these long-term projects is having secure funding. And that is a challenge for our citizen science program. You know, we're limited like NOAA on where we can get funds from. And so it's always a challenge with that. And citizen science takes a lot of retention, re-engagement, and just engagement of new people. So keeping all those in mind, you know, we try to focus on short-term projects, trying to keep that gee whiz factor going, and trying to keep people motivated in it. And sometimes we might have to, like in pivot, we might have to pivot like we did in release to try to get more engagement, where we change from a single species to a multi-species to a very iconic species being in there.
Thank you, Julia and Chip. Our next question is, can you tell us more about the upcoming SMILE project?
Sure. And so I wish we had reef people on the line. Those are the folks who are going to be able to kind of share the most information about that. And depending on who this is, I can help connect you with them if that would be helpful. But it's really being run by Reef, and they're trying to develop kind of a handheld stereo camera that can be used by divers. So Reef does an underwater survey now where they're getting information on relative abundance of fish. And so we want to add this camera to that relative abundance survey to be able to get information on the size of fish that divers are seeing. And so this project, this pilot project is really devoted to kind of developing that camera tool that would be used by divers and then testing it out with divers in the Florida Keys. So it's kind of a pilot project where we're really kind of trying to build, test, calibrate the equipment, and then use it, have volunteers use it in the field. And Chip, I don't know if you have more to add to that. And I guess the other thing we'll try to, that might be worth noting is, so we're trying to collect information on some of our data limited species, some of which are species that are kind of caught, things like black grouper or hogfish that are kind of commercial or recreationally important, and then other species that are very important to the ecosystem, things like parrotfishes, where we don't have a lot of information on them either. So trying to cover kind of both worlds within that project.
Okay, thank you. Our next question feeds into this a little bit. What's the distribution of users? Is it shoreside anglers or boatside anglers? And is it separated by user types?
I'm guessing that's a release focused question. Meg, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So our participants are offshore fishermen predominantly. Occasionally inshore fishers will catch some of the species that we collect data on. Those typically tend to be like little baby gags or something like that. So that's the majority of where our participants or that sector that they're in. And then they're distributed through our region, through Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. Did that answer your question?
We'll see. I'll see if the person who's asking responds and says that answered them. They did have a follow-up question asking if this study includes photos of both the catch and release. And if so, are those interpreted or assessed for size? And does it include a mechanism to measure and take a photo or take a photo? Sorry.
Participants can submit a photo as part of their release. They are not required to do so. We typically use that information to verify the species. We don't at the moment use like surrounding objects to inform length measurements, but that may be an option in the future. And we might ask people in the future to maybe include like a soda can or something so we can do that, but we don't currently include that in our data verification. And then you asked if it was just release, like the fish, or if it was the release, and it's just of the fish. We don't include both the fish or have them include both the fish and the release.
Great. So clarifying, you don't need a ruler or a measurement in the photo.
No, you do not. But we do have a fish ID ruler as an informational material that people can use, and they are more than welcome to include that in their photos. That would be fantastic, but it is not required.
And so I guess one other thing to note too is we're asking folks to measure to the nearest inch, just so folks get a sense of kind of what level of detail and length we're asking folks to do.
Awesome. Thank you, Julia, Chip, and Meg. I am seeing that we are at 2 o'clock. So if there are more questions and you have put them in the question panel, I will send those to our speakers and they will get back to you offline via your email that you registered with. And with that, I want to thank Julia, Chip, and Meg again for this awesome presentation. Remind everybody that we recorded, and if you did have to step away, that we will have this up on the library's YouTube shortly. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a safe and healthy rest of your Thursday. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Thank you so much.